Welcome back, Night Dwellers, to another episode of Simple Dark Stories. I'm your host, Mothy. Last week, in Camp Folkwood, Part 1, we followed Annie as she arrived at Camp Folkwood, only to be haunted by a strange wooden gnome and a series of eerie events that isolated her from the other campers. Tonight, as the camp settles into uneasy slumber, Annie is about to uncover the dark secrets lurking in the woods. What will she discover in the shadowy paths of the forest? And will she survive to see dawn? Gather close and prepare yourself for Camp Folkwood, Part 2. At night, as the camp slept, Annie lay wide awake. The silence in the cabin was suffocating, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves outside. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She was shunned, alone, and terrified. Then she heard it, tiny footsteps on the cabin floor. Her breath hitched as she slowly turned her head. In the pale moonlight filtered through the window, Annie saw the gnome. It was moving. The small figure, which had been lifeless and wooden just hours before, now crept across the cabin floor with unnerving purpose. The red hat bobbed slightly with each step, and its tiny wooden feet made a faint tapping noise on the wooden floorboards. Annie's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the gnome. It moved with a deliberate, almost sinister grace, heading toward the chair by the window. With a swift, fluid motion, the gnome climbed up the chair, then onto the windowsill. Annie's eyes widened in disbelief as the gnome pushed open the screen, its tiny hands making surprisingly light work of the task. She bit down on her lip to keep from crying out. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The gnome leapt from the windowsill, landing silently on the ground outside. Then, without a backwards glance, it scurried off into the darkness of the forest. Annie sat up in bed, her hands clutching the blanket to her chest. The gnome had come to life, and it was responsible for the destruction of the other girls' paintings. She knew she had to follow it, to prove that she was not the one who had ruined the paintings. Gathering her courage, she slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound. The night air was cool and damp as Annie stepped outside. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a ghostly light over the campgrounds. In the distance, she could just make out the faint glimmer of the gnome's red hat as it darted between the trees. Annie quickened her pace, careful to keep her distance, but determined to not lose sight of the gnome. As she followed the gnome deeper into the forest, the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl faded away, replaced by eerie silence. The trees seemed to come in all around her, their branches twisting and gnarled like the fingers of some monstrous creature. Annie's footsteps crunched on the fallen leaves, the sound echoing into the stillness. She could feel her legs growing tired, her breaths coming in shallow gasps, but she forced herself to keep going. She needed to know where the gnome was going and why it had targeted her. Gnome led her to part of the forest she had not seen before. A small clearing with a large, ancient oak tree in the center. The tree was enormous, its bark thick and rough, with roots that jutted out of the ground like the gnarled hands of a giant. The gnome stopped at the base of the tree, and began to dig with its tiny hands, moving dirt and leaves aside with surprising speed. Annie crouched behind a bush, watching intently as the gnome unearthed something from beneath the tree. It was another wooden figure, similar to the gnome, but larger, with a red hat that was faded and torn. The gnome placed the figure on the ground, then stood back, its head tilted as if waiting for something to happen. For a moment, nothing did. Then, with a sudden jolt, the larger figure's limbs began to move. Its head jerked to the side, then forward, as though awakening from a long slumber. Annie's breath caught in her throat as the figure slowly rose to its feet, towering over the gnome. The larger figure turned its head slowly, scanning the clearing until its empty eyes locked onto Annie's hiding spot. A cold, malevolent grin spread across its wooden face. The gnome pointed towards Annie, its high-pitched laughter cutting through the silence like a knife. Annie stumbled back, her heart pounding in terror. She turned and ran, her feet slipping on the damp leaves as she fled through the forest. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches clawing at her clothes and hair. She could hear the gnome's laughter echoing behind her, closer and closer with every step. Her mind raced as she tried to remember the way back to camp. Every turn looked the same. Every shadow seemed to conceal some lurking threat. She could feel the presence of the gnome and its larger companion behind her, their wooden feet tapping against the ground in relentless pursuit. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath her, and Annie tumbled into a pit, landing hard on the cold, damp earth. The wind was knocked out of her, and she lay there for a moment, gasping for breath. When she looked up, she saw the gnome standing at the edge of the pit, its grin wider than ever. The larger figure appeared beside the gnome, its empty eyes staring down at Annie. It was holding something in its hands, a small, twisted knife, the blade glinting in the moonlight. "Thanks for volunteering to repaint my hat," the gnome sneered, its voice low and gruff. It lifted the knife, pointing it at Annie. "It was getting a bit dull." Annie's blood ran cold as she realized what the gnome meant. The hat wasn't red from paint. It was stained with blood. She tried to scramble to her feet, but the pit was too deep, the walls too steep. She was trapped. The gnome and the larger figure began to descend into the pit, their movements slow and deliberate. Annie's heart raced as she searched for a way out, but there was none. The gnome reached out, its tiny hands grabbing hold of her ankle. Its grip was surprisingly strong, and Annie let out a cry of pain as it yanked her closer. "Add a fresh coat, shall we?" the gnome cackled, raising the knife high. Just as the blade was about to come down, a loud howl echoed through the forest. The gnome and its companion froze, their heads snapping towards the sound. The howl was followed by the sound of heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush. Out of the darkness, a large, shadowy figure emerged. It was a wolf, or at least that's what Annie thought at first. The creature was massive, standing on two legs like a human, but covered in thick, dark fur. Its eyes glowed with an eerie light, and its elongated snout was filled with sharp, glistening teeth. The gnomes let out a shriek of terror, dropping the knife as it scrambled to climb out of the pit. The larger figure tried to follow, but it was too slow. With a powerful leap, the wolf pounced on the larger figure, its claws tearing through the wooden body like it was made out of paper. The figure crumpled under the assault, its lifeless form splintering into pieces. The gnome managed to escape the pit, but it didn't get far. The wolf was on it in an instant, its jaws clamping down on the gnome's wooden body. The gnome let out one last scream before silenced, its body shattering into splinters under the wolf's powerful bite. Annie lay at the bottom of the pit, too stunned to move, as the wolf stood over her. Its eyes, once fierce and menacing, softened as they met hers. Slowly, the wolf began to change. Its fur receded, the snout shrank, and the husking figure diminished in size until standing before her was Goldie. Annie's eyes widened in shock and disbelief. Goldie's blonde braids were gone, replaced by tangled, matted hair, and her usually bright eyes were now a deep, haunted gold. But it was unmistakably Goldie, her face contorted with worry as she looked down at Annie. "Annie, I don't want you to find out like this," Goldie said, her voice trembling. She reached out a hand to help Annie out of the pit. Annie took her hand, her mind reeling. "Goldie, you're..." "A werewolf," Goldie finished, her voice heavy with sorrow. "It's why I come to this camp every year. It's a place where I can be myself, away from the world. But I never wanted you to get hurt." Annie's thoughts were a whirlwind. She had been betrayed, hunted, and terrified, but now she was standing face to face with the person she had considered her first friend at camp, and that friend just saved her life. "Why didn't you tell me?" Annie whispered, still in shock. Goldie sighed, her eyes downcast. "I didn't want to scare you. I didn't want to lose you as a friend. But when I realized what the gnome was doing, I couldn't let it hurt you. I had to protect you." Annie stared at Goldie, trying to process everything. The gnome, the werewolf, the betrayal. It all seemed too unreal. But as she looked at Goldie, she saw the truth in her eyes. The guilt, the sadness, and the fierce loyalty. "I don't know what to say," Annie finally admitted, her voice shaky. "You don't have to say anything," Goldie replied softly. "But I understand if you want to go home, if you don't want to be my friend anymore." Annie shook her head, her thoughts still racing. "I'm scared," she admitted. "But you saved my life, Goldie. You didn't have to, but you did. I'm not going to just abandon you." A small, relieved smile spread across Goldie's face. "Thank you, Annie. I promise I'll protect you no matter what." Annie nodded, still trying to make sense of everything that had happened. As they made their way back to camp, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, Annie knew nothing was ever going to be the same. That concludes today's episode. Join us again next week for another spine-tingling tale on Simple Dark Stories. If you enjoyed this and would like to help out, please give us 5 stars and tell us what haunts your dreams. Until next time.